I'm tired of the lies in the fantasy football community. Now, I don't know if people are just too lazy to actually do the research and dive in deep with the numbers, or maybe they don't care enough to actually look to see if what they've been saying for years is actually true or not. Now, the first thing that I wanted to debunk is the myth that people think you cannot draft a running back coming off a massive workload. I'm sure you've heard running backs coming off a massive workload are more likely to get injured, more likely to disappoint this next year. And if you just think about it, maybe it makes sense, right? Like, oh my gosh, man. I mean, Josh Jacobs is coming off a season where he just saw 340 rushing attempts. I mean, he's probably going to be beat down in 2023. Or, oh my gosh, Derrick Henry just had 350 rushing attempts. There's no way in hell that we can draft him. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to pull up every running back season since the year 2000 and then look at what the running backs did the year after they had 300 carries. So they get 300 carries on their body, and then what do they actually do the season following? I broke this down from 4 main categories. I wanted to look at the finishes inside the elite level range. That's going to be the range of running backs that would have been a top 6 option in fantasy football last year. Now, we did have to adjust the overall points scored, and how we were doing that is we were transitioning from a 16-game season back through history to a 17-game season of what you had now. So for example, we go ahead and we take Tony Pollard, who was the running back 6 last year, from an overall point scored perspective in a half PPR format. We take his total points scored, we multiply that by 16, we then divide it by 17 to get accurate historical thresholds on what you needed for a top 6 finish at the running back position, a top 12 finish, a top 24 finish, and then anybody afterwards. And if you're looking at running backs the year after a 300 carry season to not finish as a top 24 option, they were only 25%. Yeah, only 1 out of 4 running backs busted the following season in fantasy football. Now, the running backs that were running back 2, so not the guys that were top 12 options, 24%. So you had about a quarter of the guys completely busting, a quarter of the guys just being okay. Then you had 19% being a running back 1 on the low end, and over 30% elite level finishers the following season. Now, this data even gets a little bit more skewed as you put different parameters on. Now, what is interesting to see is there's not a big difference between 300 carries versus 350 carries. Like if we go through and look at 350 carries, there's still about 50% of the running backs that ended up being top 12 options the following season, but that pie chart's not going to be too different. But once we start to look at receiving volume, this completely changes everything. If you look at running backs to have 300 carries plus 50 receptions, the following season, 50% of those players were elite level running backs in fantasy. 50% of those guys were top 6 options at the position. There was another 22.5% that were anywhere from running back 12 to running back 6. So you're looking at almost 3 out of 4 instances where the running back ended up being not only a usable running back the next season, but staying healthy and finishing as a running back 1 overall that next season. You had 15% of those players as a top 24 guy, but not a top 12. And you only had 12.5% either just completely dropping off with their fantasy points or getting injured the next year, regardless of however you cut it. Only 12.5% busted with that profile. Now, what is even more surprising is you don't even have to look at the receiving volume to change this. We can actually get a better indication of which running backs are going to fall off by looking at their age as well. Now, if we compare this chart to the one that you had with just every running back after a 300 carry season, you'll see the guys that were 26 years old or younger the next year just dominating. You had almost half of these RBs being elite level options in fantasy. You only had 15.9% busting. So if you were a young running back that handled a massive workload, odds are you're going to be elite in fantasy the next season. And you see this even more if you combine everything. If you look at the running backs that had the massive rushing volume, the running backs that were used as pass catchers, and the running backs that were young at the same time, 52% of them were elite. You only had 9.5% busting. Ladies and gentlemen, this data tells us that garbage about you not being able to draft running backs coming off of massive seasons with volume, you take it, throw it in the dumpster, and never look at it again. Now, if we're looking at the running backs that are being drafted in fantasy drafts Currently, coming off a season where they had about 300 carries or more, you had Derrick Henry. Now, with the case of Derrick Henry, I would say that he's probably a little bit more prone to seeing that fall off this next year because he's older, right? He's pushing 30, and at the same time, he didn't have the receiving volume of some of these other players. He was only at 33 receptions compared to 50 plus. So maybe you use this data and say, okay, Derrick Henry is maybe a little bit more at risk. But then you go over to Josh Jacobs, a running back that's going to be younger than 26 this next season, a running back that had 340 carries, a running back that had 53 receptions at the same time. And what this data tells us is, historically speaking, Josh Jacobs has over a 50% chance of being elite in fantasy football. The probability he's a top 12 running back is about 70%. The probability that he is a top 24 running back is about 90%. That is the closest thing you get to a surefire stud in fantasy football. Yes, draft Jacobs. Don't worry about some workload nonsense. Next guy, Nick Chubb. He didn't have the receiving volume. He's a little bit older, so maybe you're a little concerned. But then Saquon Barkley, very similar to Josh Jacobs. I'm not concerned in the slightest. Yeah, Barkley had a ton of touches last season, but he also has the involvement as a pass catcher. He's also young enough to miss that threshold. So, I mean, all this data shows is just don't be worried about running backs coming off the massive years. Those are the guys you actually want to be drafting, especially if they catch the ball. And at the same time, they are young enough where you're not worried about the age fall off. But now the other thing that I needed to look into was this running back dead zone. Now, if y'all aren't familiar, the running back dead zone was a thing back in 2018, 2019, 2020 that nobody talked about, right? And we tried to get everybody we could to listen to us. I mean, back in the day, you had running backs like Mike Davis getting drafted in rounds 4 and 5, these guys that didn't have talented profiles, and it made no sense for them to go that early just because they projected to see volume. Well, now every single time I select, say, J.K. Dobbins round 8, Javonte Williams round 7. My comments are flooded. Mason, you idiot. Don't you know about the running back dead zone? Mason, don't you know you should be going 0 RB? And I said it last year, and this is what led us to drafting Josh Jacobs as our most drafted player and winning $150,000 on Underdog Fantasy. The running back dead zone no longer exists. It was a thing before everybody was talking about it, but now that everybody and their mom knows about it, I mean, it's been priced in. People are wrong. You actually want to be pivoting when other people are trying to avoid those backs and maybe look into targeting them. But as we go through this data, of course, I do have to give a shout out to where we are drafting every single night on this live stream, where we won $150,000 last year on Underdog Fantasy. Y'all know their best ball drafts in no time commitment at all during the season. That's why it's the best place for you to get into some extra drafts and get some practice in for your main fantasy football league this year. I'm streaming Underdog drafts every single night on our live stream. And if you want to join one with us, you can use the promo code FLOCK where they'll match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to $100. You'll get our 2023 fantasy football rankings, a free trial to flockfantasy.com where you can find our 2023 fantasy football draft guide. They also just dropped their week 1 pick'ems where a couple of my favorite lines are going to be Cortland Sutton for fewer than 59.5 receiving yards and DJ Moore for more than 46.5 receiving yards against the Packers. But also, if you use promo code FLOCK and only for promo code FLOCK users, you'll be getting a Josh Allen special pick'em, more than less than half a passing yard week 1. So please make sure you are taking advantage of that. Work my butt off to get it for you. But let's go ahead and let's track ADP and how this has changed through history, right? I wanted to look at 2017 through 2023 to get a sense of where people have been historically taking running backs and maybe if a strategy is dead or not. So if you go from the round 1 RBs, from 2017 through 2022, on average, you had about 7 to 8 running backs getting drafted inside the first round in drafts. And back in 2020, you had 10 picks in the first round, all being RB. Well, now it depends on the drafting platform that you're looking at, but in underdog drafts, you only have 3 running backs going round 1. Even in your regular ESPN redraft format, you only have 5 RBs going in the first round. This is fewer than any other year we've seen. Going over to the top 2 rounds, you're kind of seeing the same thing. The top 2 rounds throughout time, you had about 14 running backs getting drafted every single season. Well, now in underdog drafts, you have 7. In your regular ESPN redraft league, you only have 8. I'm sure y'all notice every single person trying to tell you to go 0 RB, 0 RB, 0 RB. Have they looked at this data? 0 RB was a very profitable strategy that we used to implement back in 2017, 18, 2019, 2020 before people caught on. But now that everybody's doing it, the values have changed. The draft strategy that worked then may not work now. I mean, if we go over to the top 3 rounds in ESPN regular redraft leagues this season, you only have 13 running backs getting drafted. Throughout history, you had 18 to 19. Going over to round 4, throughout history, you had anywhere from about 20 to 24 running backs going inside the first 4 rounds. This season, in underdog drafts, you only have 14. In your ESPN redraft format, you only have 16. I mean, going over to round 5, throughout history, you have about 25. ESPN this year, you only have 22. Round 6, throughout history, you have about 29. This year, you only have 25. Round 7, throughout history, you have about 31, 32. This year, you only have 30. Round 8, throughout history, you have about 36, 37. This year, you only have 32. Round 9, throughout history, you had 40 to 41. This year, you only have 34. And round 10, throughout history, you had about 42 to 43. And this year, you only have 36. So anybody going through and trying to tell you that you cannot draft the middle round running back values that we have currently, please ask them if they are looking at historical data or if they are adjusting to what we have this season. Because some of my favorite running back values in drafts right now are actually these guys in the middle rounds, just like they were last year when we were taking David Montgomery so often in round 6, when we were taking Josh Jacobs so often in round 7. I mean, if we go through to find some of my favorite running back values at the moment, I mean, I'm going to skip by the early rounds, right? Let's go ahead and let's go straight to the quote unquote running back dead zone, where if we are stepping into round 4, here you have Ramondre Stevenson getting drafted next to Keenan Allen and behind Deebo Samuel. If we go into round 5, you're looking at a running back that has all the upside in the world in Kenneth Walker going into year 2, Breece Hall going into year 2, getting drafted next to names like DJ Moore, Chris Godwin. Stepping into round 6 in these ESPN drafts, I mean, at this point, you are looking at Javonte Williams not even getting drafted. Javonte's not going till round 7. J.K. Dobbins is not going till round 8, round 9. I mean, we can even slide down further than this and look at a running back like Khalil Herbert, pick 95. A.J. Dillon, 98. These are running backs that throughout history would not have gone this late. Throughout history, these running backs would have gone in round 5, round 6, where if instead we can just be picking them up 3 rounds later, then yeah, maybe they weren't good picks in round 5, but in round 8, round 9, it's a different season, it's a different slate, it's different data, and you can feel fine going through and pulling that trigger. Now, of course, I'm not telling you to completely change your draft strategy. I'm not telling that you have to be taking these running backs in the middle rounds. But I'm saying that the draft strategy we used to exploit years ago is no longer exploitable because everybody and their mom knows about it. As soon as everybody knows about it, as soon as it's said on every single YouTube channel on the planet, every single podcast on the planet, it's probably not something that's going to be worth looking into just because, I mean, hell, you're going up against your league mates with the same exact information at their disposal. Try to find the new trends, try to find the things that are going to happen going forward, not what worked 6, 7, 8 years ago. But I think that's all I have. If y'all think there are any other running back myths that we need to go ahead and debunk, please drop them down in the comment section. And of course, if you want to get in a draft with us tonight, tomorrow, the next day on the live stream, we're drafting every single day on Underdog Fantasy. You can find that link in the comment section or the description of this video. If you use promo code FLOCK, they're going to match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to $100. Plus, you'll get our 2023 fantasy football rankings, a free trial to flockfantasy.com where you can find our 2023 fantasy football draft guide. And make sure you are taking advantage of the Josh Allen special pick'em. More than less than half a passing yard against the Jets week 1 that I worked my butt off to get for everybody who used promo code FLOCK. But thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. I really do appreciate you, and I really hope that I get to draft with you in a live stream later tonight.